Hi there, John Lustria and Jake Wynn, pointing this way, he might be over there. John Lustria and Jake Wynn coming to you live over the internet from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We're coming to you talking about, on the eve of the election in the United States here, talking about the politics of Civil War medicine. We'll stay firmly in the 19th century, which I'm sure will be a welcome break for all of us. Yeah, we're going to talk about the kind of unexpected ways that politics influenced medical care during, before, during, and a little bit after the Civil War. So it's going to be an exciting discussion. Don't hesitate to chime in the comments where you're watching from, or if you have any questions during the program. It's wonderful to be with you all on this Monday afternoon. If you're new here, we are the National Museum of Civil War Medicine Education Coordinator John Lustria, joined by our Director of Interpretation, Jake Wynn. And we're excited to bring another installment of our digital programming to you. If you're not new here, you know we do these sorts of programs at least twice a week, and they continue to exist. So if you missed the beginning or you tune in late, they continue to exist on our Facebook page and eventually on our YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe to each of those if you want to stay up to date with everything we're doing. If you like this video, consider liking this video. There's a little like button that helps us out quite a bit. And if you share the video, it helps other people see it. And the more people see it, the better it is for us. So if you enjoy these and you want to help us out, that's one way that you can do it. I know I personally would be very grateful. And then the other way that you can really help us out, if you've been enjoying all these videos we've been doing throughout the pandemic, or if you happen to enjoy this one that we do here, please consider becoming a member of the museum. Our members allow us to continue doing this sort of programming. It's just a once a year payments for as low as $25 a year. That's way cheaper than a Netflix subscription. And well, you can't quite choose exactly what you want to watch with us, but you get quality programming a couple times a week. So you can't beat that for that price. Not that you have to pay the price. We're happy to continue bringing free programming, but we can bring you free programming because we have such generous donors and wonderful members. And I and we have been overwhelmed by the generosity of our viewers. So if you haven't become a member yet, maybe today is the day to do so. And if you already have, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. It helps us out quite a bit. I see we've already got some people tuning in the comments. Trish watching from Williamsburg, Virginia. Excellent. Mariette from South Africa. Excellent. Hey, the Williamsburg Battlefield Association is also here. Williamsburg represented pretty strong. Civil War Trails is tuning in. Gary from Ellicott City, Maryland. Excellent. Man, a lot of people tuning in from all over the place today. So that's an awful lot of fun. Paul, museum member in Pittsburgh. Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate that. We're having a grand old time here today on Monday. Let's see, Barbara from New Jersey. Matthew from Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. David from Pensacola. Excellent. This is great stuff, and I'm excited for our conversation today. And the way that we're going to do it is Jake and I have each prepared a few mini presentations. He's got sort of a two-parter that merged into one mega small part or something. I'm sure I'm not describing that quite so accurately. And I have a mini presentation of my own. So it should be a good time. We'll get things started with Jake here. Do you want to kick us off, Jake?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, John, for the introduction. Thank you all for watching today. We were thinking, going back a couple of months, you know, we knew that the election season is going to be one filled with stress, and you know, we have been talking about politics relentlessly in this country. So we thought we'd take a cool spin on this and talk a little bit about the history of politics as it relates to Civil War medical care. And there's actually quite a bit of overlap. And I come from a background of all different sorts of history. I do medical history now at the museum, military history as well, but I've long been fascinated by political history, and the Civil War era is a fascinating time to look at political history. This presentation, what I want to talk about today, is a little bit more about how public opinion impacted Civil War medical care. Public opinion, of course, today, it's an election. We are a democracy. We are a country that goes to the polls every 4 years for presidential and much more frequently for other local and state elections. So wanted to take a look at how politics impacted Civil War medicine, and ultimately how Civil War medicine kind of feeds back into the political world in mid-19th century America, especially focused on the Civil War era. And so starting with that, you have to get to the public perception of medical care during the war. And this is where a lot of the myths that we talk about at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine really come into play. When we start to look at, what does the average American, North or South, think about medical care during the Civil War time period. And then we have to look at kind of what are their sources, where are they getting that information from? And ultimately, how does it shape their opinion of what that medical care was like? Whether they had experienced it themselves on the battlefield, if they were soldiers in the army or civilians who had been treated in a military hospital, what was that like? How did it impact their political opinions? And then also, how does the care for sick and wounded soldiers, how does that impact the political sphere? How does that impact the politicians making policy? How does that impact Jefferson Davis or Abraham Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln specifically thinking all through his presidency about his re-election campaign? How does the medical department of the U.S. Army kind of come into play there? So where I kind of got an initial introduction to this topic comes from September of 1862, time period that those of you that follow the National Museum of Civil War Medicine here on Facebook, watch our programs, have come to the museum, you're going to get very familiar with, and you may already be very familiar with. So John, if you want to advance to our next slide there.
Hold on. There we go.
Cool. All right. So this is an issue of the New York Herald, published in September of 1862. You can see September 15th. So the Maryland campaign is well underway. We are one day after the Battle of South Mountain, just west of Frederick, where the museum is based. And the armies are on the move to the Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg. So we're just in that in-between between South Mountain and the Battle of Antietam that's going to take place 2 days later. New York Herald, what you need to know about this particular newspaper is that this was one of the big three New York newspapers, which you can kind of think of in a similar fashion to the place that the three major cable news networks have today. So today, you're flipping through TV news, you're going to come across the big three, so to speak, of CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. And they each have their own kind of political bias. They each have their own biases. And the same thing was true of the New York Herald and the New York newspapers of the 1860s. So New York Herald of James Bennett is more of a kind of conservative newspaper published out of New York. It's going to become very super anti-Lincoln, but is more opposed to the Lincoln administration, and in many cases some of the war effort as well. You go to some of the other newspapers. New York Times is going to be one of those big newspapers, and then Horace Greeley's New York Tribune. So they have the ability to shape public opinion because these newspapers are read all across the United States, and shattered by the war, despite the fact that the war is going on, these newspapers are being sent, in many cases, through the lines to the south. So this is actually being read, and you can go into Southern newspapers from the 1860s and read dispatches that are usually a couple of weeks old from the New York newspapers. So this is a really important way of shaping Americans' opinions of what's going on in the world. And this is, folks today talk a lot about, in terms of all of the bias that you see in terms of something like cable news. Well, the newspapers of the 19th century were unabashed in their opinions. They held nothing back. There is no focus on trying to be neutral. Neutrality didn't really exist. They all are very on their sleeves of what their opinions are. Now, all of this being said, newspapers are the main way that folks are getting their information and their news during the Civil War era in the United States. You could find multiple newspapers scattered all across the country. In many cities, many larger communities will have multiple newspapers that are going to be dedicated to oftentimes many different political slants. And so the reason I'm kind of expressing all of this is because it's going to be important to understand what's going to come when we look at public opinion and how it shapes the views of medical care during the war. Much of that is coming from a partisan lens, even during the Civil War era. So it's important to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of my brief kind of mini presentation for you all today. So this time period, September of 1862, is kind of where I got introduced to this idea that there is this public opinion is impacting the views of Civil War medicine and also how Civil War medicine is being practiced. So I have an example here that's from this edition, the September 15th edition of the New York Herald. Let me pull that up here. All right, so it comes from page 4 of this particular edition of the New York Herald. And it actually had to do with the aftermath of the Battle of Second Bull Run. So for those of you who have been here watching with us and may have seen our virtual field trip out to the Manassas battlefield, where we talked about the aftermath of Second Bull Run and the lack of an organized ambulance corps that was present during that particular battle, the New York Herald is actually writing about this in the wake of that battle leading up to Antietam. And they have an editorial where they write about the lack of an ambulance corps within the United States Army and how detrimental that was to the soldiers who are serving out there at the front lines of the battlefield, talking that they needed a well-trained and properly systematized ambulance department in connection with the Army. If not, you will repeat what happened at Second Bull Run, casualties left out on the battlefields for days, over and over again, and that is going to have consequences. And when they talk about the consequences, and from that particular battlefield and moving forward to other future battles, there is a political connection. And they're talking about it right here in this particular editorial. They're talking about how Americans on the home front are viewing this conflict and their support for the war, which the New York Herald does support at this stage of the conflict. Their support for the war is very much tied up with, and many Americans, many Northerners, of course it's a New York newspaper, Northerners are thinking that they have their loved ones out on the front lines of the battlefield. They want to know that their loved ones are safe. Civil War battlefields aren't safe. So how are those soldiers going to be cared for if something should happen to them? So this is very much a morale issue, both for the Army, for the soldiers, and that's what this editorial talks about, talking about the morale issue for the soldiers at the front lines, getting the best out of those soldiers, because if they are wounded, they want to know that someone's going to come and pick them up, take them off the battlefield, remove them, get them to the best care possible. What is important to remember about where we are at this stage of Civil War medical care is that we're right on the eve of one of the biggest advances, and that's going to be Jonathan Letterman's ambulance system. So John, if you would go to the next slide, please. All right, so an ambulance drill here we see in this photograph. It's actually taken in 1864. So public opinion about Civil War medical care in the first year of the war is overwhelmingly negative. Medical department, you will see almost every editorial written, people's opinions in their diaries and their letters is in the first year of the conflict almost virtually negative. accepting those that actually work in the healthcare field. So those who are up close and personal with it and are actually knowing what challenges are facing the surgeons and the nurses who are trying to administer care during this crisis of the Civil War. Those outside, soldiers, officers, folks at home, politicians making policy, they're all virtually universally down on the medical department and what is being done on the battlefield. And so this is one of the issues that is actually getting a guy named Jonathan Letterman to inspire him to take better care of these soldiers. So if John, if you would jump to our next slide here to show off Mr. Letterman, or Dr. Letterman. So this is Dr. Letterman. You've heard me talk about him if you've watched many of our other videos, but he was very much focused on improving the medical department of the United States Army, specifically with the Army of the Potomac in mind. And he will be in charge of that organization's medical department from 1862 until the end of 1863. And so Letterman has this idea that he needs to reform this system, and he has in many ways the reputation of the US Army's medical department in mind as he's making these changes. He understands his job when he comes into that office in the summer of 1862 is to fix a system that was very broken, that everyone understood was broken. Not enough doctors, not enough well-trained, efficient, and knowledgeable doctors, not enough ambulances, not enough of a system in place to make sure that you can evacuate wounded soldiers off the battlefield, get them back to medical attention, get them back to medical care quickly, give them the best care possible. This is what Letterman's mandate was when he was brought in. And he has public opinion. He has the opinions of the American people in mind as he is doing this work. And we know this because he writes about it in his report after the Battle of Antietam. So Letterman's system first goes into place at the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, comes in the wake of a disastrous medical response to the Battle of Second Bull Run. And this is what Letterman writes in his report, which is published after the campaign is over. This is what he says, quote, "The surgery of these battlefields has been pronounced butchery. Gross misrepresentations of the conduct of medical officers have been made and scattered broadcast over the country, causing deep and heartrending anxiety to those who have had friends or relatives in the Army, who might at any moment require the services of a surgeon. It is not supposed that there were no incompetent surgeons in the Army. It is certainly true that there were, but these sweeping denunciations against a class of men who will favorably compare with the military surgeons of any country because of the incompetency and shortcomings of a few are wrong and do injustice to a body of men who have labored faithfully and well. It is easy to magnify an existing evil until it is beyond the bounds of truth. It is equally easy to pass by the good that has been done on the other side. Some medical officers lost their lives in their devotion to duty in the Battle of Antietam, and others sickened from excessive labor, which they conscientiously and skillfully performed. If any objection could be urged against the surgery of those fields, it would be the efforts on the part of surgeons to practice, quote, conservative surgery to too great of an extent." So this is interesting. This particular passage here is Jonathan Letterman responding to the critics of the medical department from the first year of the Civil War. This is his way of snapping back and saying, hey, this is not the medicine that was being administered in 1861. We are reforming, we are creating a new system, and you need to give credit where credit is due for the fact that these surgeons are saving lives. The reason that he is being forced to write this is from things that are being written that sound a bit like this. So this is from the Indianapolis Star. This is a newspaper published in Indianapolis, Indiana, in October of 1862. Crucially, this is written exactly a month after the Battle of Antietam is over, after Letterman had put the system in place that saves lives on the battlefield at Antietam. And what is most important about this is written about 2 weeks before a midterm election across these northern states. And the Indianapolis Star is a Democratic newspaper. What you'll find throughout this newspaper is anti-Lincoln everything. Lincoln is the most terrible president ever. You're going to see it in this newspaper. And this is the way they characterize the medical care being administered at Antietam. Now remember Letterman's words, him saying that this is being pronounced butchery, that it is incorrect, this surgery is saving lives, and these surgeons are really good at their jobs. This is what the Indianapolis Star writes. It is entirely different. There's a great deal is being said in the papers about the organization of the ambulance corps. Having seen the absence of the necessity of such a corps on the battlefield, I have paid some attention to the subject. I am satisfied that in spite of all the talk in regard to the matter, there is still no properly organized ambulance corps in existence. This is a grievous wrong to the brave men who are upholding the cause of the Union on the battlefield. The scenes after the battle near Centerville 6 weeks ago, that would be the Battle of Second Bull Run, and after the battles at South Mountain and Antietam were not merely disgraceful to the War Department and to the medical department of the Army, but were actually disgraceful to humanity. Thousands of our bravest and best soldiers laid for days on those battlefields, and hundreds of them died there days after days of agonizing suffering for the want of properly organized ambulance corps. The surgeons were not to blame. They worked incessantly for a week, day and night, but they could not get their patients removed, and these scenes must continue to be enacted after every large battle until this disgraceful want has been supplied. So the reason that I draw attention to this particular editorial is because it gets shuffled into this partisan lens. And when we start to look at, again, on the northern side, we'll get to the kind of southern side of this situation in just a second. But when we start to look at these reports about what is being written of the medical department and the surgeons and the nurses and the medical personnel working in these hospitals, is that what is being written about them in this public sphere and the newspapers of the time, again, the cable news of the 1860s, is very much being viewed in this partisan lens. So if you want to read good, exciting changes that are taking place in the Army, you'll end up reading them in the newspapers that support Abraham Lincoln. If you want to see the medical department are inefficient and have no idea what they're doing, and that this is butchery on the battlefields, you're going to go to the anti-Lincoln, in some cases anti-war newspapers. So this is all being viewed through this partisan lens. So these battles that are taking place in Washington over what the war is all about is oftentimes being continued to fight. And one of the main areas that it is being battled over is in these discussions about the medical department. Who is caring for these wounded soldiers? How are they being cared for? And this plays out interestingly when you start to look locally, even at the state level. So John, if you go to our next slide there. So I just love this photo because this is a very interesting looking character. And in a way, I picked him kind of for you, John. This was Richard Yates, who's the governor of Illinois during the Civil War. Kind of a friend and political ally of Lincoln in ways. And his story actually, and just reading a little bit about him, kind of shadows Lincoln in an interesting way. He was born in a log cabin in Kentucky, for example, very similar to what Abraham Lincoln experienced in his youth. The reason I have Governor Yates here is because it's interesting, you can find these battles over relief and caring for wounded and sick soldiers, even when you step away from the national political world and you step into kind of the local politics, and all politics is local, right? So let's take a look at what's going on in Illinois. So Illinois is, of course, home to Lincoln, but has a very strong opposition party to the Republican Party there. And the battles that are fought in the state House of Representatives and state Senate in Illinois are brutal in many ways before the Civil War and during the Civil War, and you could say even up to the present day. So what is happening there during the 1860s, and there's an incident in particular in 1863 I want to look at, is that they're fighting over everything. Democrats, Republicans. And one of the things that is going to generate the most heat is actually a bill to provide supplies, medical supplies specifically, for Illinois troops who are serving at the front lines with the US Army. And this is going to become a partisan football, with the idea that Republicans, Lincoln supporters, want to give the wounded soldiers more supplies, more medical supplies, give them more money, taking them directly out of the state coffers and sending these supplies off to the Army. What you have on the other side is the opponents to the kind of pro-war faction within Illinois state politics is, it's too expensive. We don't want to give these goods, these supplies, this money to the soldiers at the front line through the U.S. Army, because in a way we're kind of turning over all of this money, all of this state money, to the federal government. And so there's this battle going back and forth, and the barbs become particularly nasty. Governor Yates gets brought into this, and the idea of even something as seemingly uniting as getting supplies, medical supplies and relief supplies to Illinois soldiers at the front lines of the Civil War, back home on the home front in Illinois. This is the hot button political issue that you see in the summer of 1863. Even as Gettysburg is being fought, these battles are being waged in the Illinois State House, all over, again, medical care for the soldiers at the front lines. And this is not just a northern issue. I've been talking about the U.S. Army quite a bit. That is especially because some of the political battles there are going to be pretty brutal through the Civil War era. But if we can take a look down to the South as well. John, if you want to go to our next slide. And if you start to go through and read the editorials, the letters that are published in Southern newspapers, you're going to see a lot of the same kinds of criticism. This is a newspaper from 1862, actually from Staunton, Virginia. It's republishing a piece from the Richmond Whig, which is talking about issues that are very similar to what are being experienced on the northern side of the conflict. Criticism of the medical department for inefficient care for the soldiers who are serving in the Army. Specifically, kind of looking at some of the more terrible scenes that you see in the aftermath of a major battle. In this case, the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg, where Confederate wounded are going to be brought back to Richmond's hospitals and are going to be in pretty rough shape. And so there is a constant drumbeat. When you start to look at newspapers, you start to look at letters and diaries from those on the home front, there is pressure being applied to improve the medical departments of these armies, Union and Confederate, because it is understood that you need to keep these men happy because you want to keep them in the ranks. You want to make sure that they're fighting at the front lines and they're fighting as best they can, knowing that if they are wounded, they're going to be properly cared for. But you're also worried about those folks on the home front, because the home front is very much connected to the front lines. You need those supplies, you need food, you need those folks at home to be invested in the war effort that is going on, and you want them to be supportive of that war effort. And in some cases, you want them to vote for the party that will, continue that war effort until it is ultimately completed and a victory has been gained. And so the medical department gets drawn into a lot of these debates about the war, about what the war is all about, and ultimately about how the soldiers themselves are going to be cared for. You see it come to kind of a head in our next slide here. This is one of my favorite political cartoons of the 1860s, the Civil War era. This is, of course, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis pulling apart the United States while Little Mac, General McClellan, is trying to stop them. So the 1864 election is a great way to kind of start to dive into how public opinion really, and over the course of the Civil War, how public opinion has changed in regards to the way the medical department of the U.S. Army operates. And John's going to talk a little bit more about circumstances related to this within the US Army's medical department itself related to the 1864 election. What's interesting, when you start to examine especially the editorials that are being written in northern newspapers in the lead up to the 1864 election, is many of them are going back to this kind of old cliche about General McClellan. That General McClellan was a friend of the soldier, that he was someone who cared very deeply about the care for the soldiers who had been in battle, the veterans who are still serving in the Army, and those who have suffered, who have been wounded, and in some cases been killed, and their families. That McClellan is very much kind of even hoarded his army during his service with the Army of the Potomac, not being necessarily willing to take a lot of risks with that army. This is all controversial, and lots of people have arguments about General George McClellan. But you see this really being discussed in the lead up to the 64 election, where McClellan is running against incumbent Abraham Lincoln. When we see in the Democratic newspapers, of course, McClellan is running as a Democrat in the 1864 election. You see him being referred to as the friend of the soldier, caring for the wounded, and you see the Lincoln administration being cast as these blood-hungry monsters who don't care at all for the wounded soldier, for the plight of the wounded, for the plight of the sick, that they have put folks in charge of their armies like US Grant and William Sherman, these men that really press hard on their men to accomplish these objectives, and that's going to lead to some of the highest casualty figures of the war. 1864 is the bloodiest year of the conflict, and you see these debates about what does this war all about, and also how are these soldiers being cared for in these military hospitals. All of that gets kind of viewed through, again, this partisan lens. That Democratic newspapers say that wounded soldiers aren't being given the right care, the casualty numbers are too high. Is this war worth it? Meanwhile, you have on the Republican side, you have those saying that, yes, the care has improved significantly. You see in 1864 an ambulance bill being passed through Congress by Senator Henry Wilson, his bill to push through an organized ambulance system for the entirety of the U.S. Army. So these battles that we talk about at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine over and over and over again about the evolution of battlefield medicine, that is playing out in real time. People are aware of this during the conflict, and it is shaping their opinion about how medical care is being administered during the war. Ultimately, though, John, if you'll go to my last slide here, what you end up with is kind of, as a result of this ongoing kind of public perception battle that is going on between the surgeons and the practitioners who are practicing medicine and the public, you see kind of two tracks in the way that Civil War medicine is going to be remembered. On the one hand, you have the medical and surgical history of the war. We're going to talk a little bit more about that with John here in just a second, in that the medical practitioners, the surgeons, those in the U.S. Army understand that they are under a lens, and they are going to essentially make their case of how medicine evolved during the conflict, and we are going to make American medicine better overall as a result of studying how we evolved during the Civil War and what medical care we administered. So they generate this. They generate the Army Medical Museum. They're telling their story in their own words and in their own terms. They're showing it. They're showing their evidence. They're collecting their evidence. They're showing it. Civil War medicine evolved. Civil War medicine was actually, under the circumstances, pretty incredible what they were able to accomplish. That's the scientific, that's the historical value that they understood, that the surgeons, the doctors who were practicing medicine understood that they needed to put out there to the public. Then there's the other side, the public view of Civil War medicine, which is going to be infused in, as a result of these partisan battles and bickering, with a lot of these negative stereotypes of what Civil War medicine was. The idea that the surgeons were inefficient and incompetent, that they had no idea what they were doing, that they were cutting off arms and legs left or right. That's what Letterman was referring to as conservative surgery, where he's talking about, that these doctors actually didn't amputate enough limbs. They could have saved more lives had they actually done more amputations. The public view of Civil War medicine is very much formed out of these battles that are playing out in the newspaper, in the press, in personal correspondence about kind of a skewed view of what medical care was like during the conflict in a very negative capacity. And this comes down the ages to us today. So you can very much trace some of these, kind of stereotypes today that we see about Civil War medicine being, give a guy a bottle of whiskey and hack off his arm or leg. Those kinds of stories, you can actually go back to these newspaper accounts and editorials from the 1860s in newspapers, and you can actually see the origins of that kind of narrative that we are still at the museum. John and I, we experience and deal with this all the time, that we are still kind of pushing back to say, hey, we need to look at this medical and surgical history. We need to look at the records that they kept, the case studies they performed, because the reality of this is that Civil War medicine is somewhere in the middle. It's in the middle of these two narratives. And when we start to look at how people felt about Civil War medicine and oftentimes how they voted as a result of that, it is all connected to this story. So I contend that this is kind of an understudied element of Civil War medical care, of this perception that existed during the war that was in many cases shaped for partisan means and for partisan ends. So John, that's where I'm gonna flip it back over to you. I'm not sure if we've had any questions or comments,
yeah. Thank you, Jake. I love that. And first of all, I had a question from Tracy in the comments. She missed the first 25-ish minutes of the program, and will it be available? The short answer is yes. All of our videos and such continue to live on our Facebook page and on our YouTube channel as well. So if you missed the beginning, never fear. You will, when we finish up here, have the chance to go back and watch that. Yeah, fascinating point there, about how that there's more to this kind of debate just than within the medical community. It's not just discussion between doctor to doctor, saying, this method of treatment works, this method doesn't, this is a better way of doing this, that, or the other thing, but that there is a public dimension to this in a way that is, you don't always see, certainly with, private medical practices today. There's not quite the same kind of public element, or even military medicine today. I mean, there's some of that, but not quite along the same line. So I think that's really interesting that you highlight almost sort of the public relations battle that the Army Medical Department has to kind of deal with. I talked a little bit about that in a previous video that we did. I talked about it with Kyle. The title of that video is called Civil War Medicine and the Body. And I kind of point towards this, what I refer to as a public relations battle. And Jake here is highlighting it again. I think that's so interesting. Do you want to say, underscore that or say any more about that?
Yeah, I will say that I only really scratched the surface of this. There's a lot more here. There's a lot more here that I've gone down this rabbit hole, and will hopefully be able to write a little bit more about this for the blog. And maybe talk about this again in the future. I will say that, just as we are experiencing today, public health medicine is political. And I think that the importance of that during the Civil War era has kind of been under discussed. I think that there's definitely, there's some more lots more to look into here. And I'm excited to play a part in that.
So now I'm going to take a slightly different look at the ways that politics impacted Civil War medicine. And I'm going to highlight the instances or the cases of two particular individuals. So this calls for yet another PowerPoint here. Okay. And we'll get to this quote in just a little bit, which I think is a great quote. The outs wanted to become the ins. But my story today starts with this gentleman here, William Alexander Hamilton. He becomes the Surgeon General of the Army, the Union Army, April 25th, 1862. Now, knowing how he got there plays a role in this story. So you'll notice he becomes Surgeon General about a year into the conflict. So they had a year's worth of, I believe, 2 other Surgeon Generals, at least one, but I think 2. One of whom I think dies at the post, and the following is very conservative in terms of trying to enact any sort of meaningful change, spending lots of money. He doesn't really do that. He's content to let the medical department run the way it had been run for the past several decades. And it becomes immediately clear in the early days of the Civil War that the Army Medical Department is grossly unprepared for the magnitude of the conflict that is the Civil War. And so by the time that lesson had become clear, they were already sort of nearly a year into the war, and non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, like the United States Sanitary Commission, something that functions a little bit like the modern day Red Cross. It's not the modern day Red Cross, but it is kind of like this, providing emergency relief supplies to the front lines in the aftermath of battles. In the early days of the Civil War, it became clear that organizations like the United States Sanitary Commission totally, had their stuff together, and they were doing a better job almost at caring for Union soldiers than doing a better job caring for the Union soldiers almost than the Army Medical Department itself. And so when Lincoln wants to make a change to the Surgeon General, he approaches the Sanitary Commission and says, who do you think I should pick? Is there a candidate that you like? And they provided a list, and they eventually go with William Alexander Hamilton. Now, he's pretty young when he becomes the Surgeon General. He's only 34 years old. And he leapfrogs quite a few people in terms of seniority at the position, which ruffles some feathers, including, but not limited to, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. He would often say that Hammond was, quote, the Sanitary Commission's Surgeon General, not mine. Now, this is a problem because Edwin Stanton is Hammond's immediate superior. So they're already kind of butting heads before, they really get to, what Hammond's job is going to be here. Now, Hammond institutes vast and sweeping changes, which are incredibly positive, and we could spend, do a whole program on each of these individually. He raises the requirements of admission into the Army Medical Corps, so basically trying to weed out the people who probably shouldn't be surgeons in the first place, vastly increasing the number of available hospital beds. He vastly raises that number. He founds the Army Medical Museum, which today still exists as the National Museum of Health and Medicine. He creates kind of what Jake was talking about earlier, the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. He issues something called Circular Number 2, which basically tells all the Union surgeons that they're collecting medical specimens, which will be stored in the Army Medical Museum. They're going to try and learn from the war, part of this whole public relations campaign that I alluded to earlier. Hammond's the one that kind of institutes this. He promotes Surgeon Jonathan Letterman to command of the medical department of the Army of the Potomac, and Letterman, of course, brings about sweeping reforms, which we've talked about in other videos on our channel, including but not limited to a better system for evacuating wounded soldiers, creating the ambulance corps. So Hammond does a host of good as the Surgeon General, but he was described by many, including himself actually, as being a bit abrasive. And Hammond described himself, years after the fact, of his time at Surgeon General as thinking himself, quote, a bit puffed up, which I think is kind of an amusing descriptor there. Well, this kind of abrasiveness didn't sit well with Stanton, and like what Jake was talking about earlier with the poor medical response and the lack of ambulances at the Battle of Second Bull Run, Hammond actually in some ways kind of utilizes some of these editorials that Jake was talking about, and basically writes a letter to Stanton and borderline accuses him of willful neglect, and confronts him in a very direct way, saying that the medical department needs control of the ambulances, not the quartermaster department, which is how it was set up before the Civil War. So Hammond flies in the face of Stanton, is not thinking about any sort of reputation or relationship there, but he's saying, this has to change, you're doing a bad job. If you let me do this, I'll do a better job. I'll change the way things have been done, and all that sort of thing. So that doesn't do much to solidify the relationship that they have. Hammond, though, or Stanton, I should say, kind of went along with a lot of the reforms that Hammond was making because they ultimately proved to be effective. But what is often held up as sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, Stanton's kind of looking for a way to undermine him because there isn't that sort of positive relationship there. And in May of 1863, William Hammond does something that seems very sensible to our 21st century minds. He bans calomel and tartar emetic, which both contain mercury, from the Army's supply tables. He doesn't give any prior notice that he's going to do this. And now, today, of course, it seems like a no-brainer. Like, yes, you should get rid of mercury from a medicine chest. But at the time, it was used quite liberally, and it was a popular remedy among many doctors. Hammond, in looking at the data, thinks that it's being used too liberally. He doesn't necessarily think that it shouldn't ever be used, but he thinks it's being used too much, and that it's too often producing harmful effects. So he says, well, let's just get rid of it. There's almost a universal denunciation of Hammond among the rank and file of Union surgeons, saying, how could you do this? Why would you do this? It makes no sense. So here we're talking about the kind of intra-medical, the debate within the medical community, which Stanton kind of latches onto and says, this could be my chance to do this. And so shortly after this, he sends Hammond on an inspection tour of hospital sites located in Union-occupied territories in the South. And in the meantime, he appoints Surgeon James Barnes to be acting Surgeon General. When Hammond finally returns, which takes him several months, because in the process he falls down a flight of stairs, injures himself pretty severely, has to be cared for in a hospital in Philadelphia. It's a whole ordeal, but when Hammond finally returns, he demands to return to his post, be given his full authority back now that he's physically capable of doing the job again. And Stanton refuses, and so Hammond says, well, either fully restore me to my position or conduct a formal review of my tenure as Surgeon General. And so one thing leads to another. There's a formal review, and Stanton ends up sort of convicting Hammond of a number of ticky-tack little bureaucratic offenses. He's not even actually convicted of anything that has to do with removing mercury from the medicine tables of Union surgeons, but this kind of turns the opinion of the medical community against Hammond. So they get him for things like, cutting through red tape, buying supplies from, poor sources. He spent too much money here. He appointed his friends there. All these things that are individually fairly minor, but they're able to add up enough that Hammond is eventually removed from office as the Surgeon General, and Surgeon Barnes is appointed full-time the Surgeon General of the Army. So these sort of political loyalties, maintaining good relationships with the people in power is vitally important in order to conduct one's job. And the same thing goes for John Brinton here. I'll get to him in a moment, but Brinton, who ends up being a pretty important person in our country's medical history, his initial take on Hammond ends up to prove pretty accurate of the way that, he's pretty incisive, I should say, of the way that Hammond's career went. So Brinton wrote about Hammond, the medical department of the Army, which for the first few months of the war had shown almost imbecility, and which had been conducted on the basis of the Army establishment of the Mexican War, had undergone a change. An active man, Dr. William A. Hammond, impulsive, it is true, but of far-reaching view and sanguine temperament, had been raised to the office of Surgeon General and had infused fresh life and energy throughout the whole department. Much has been said against him. Heavy charges have been pressed, but from an intimate knowledge of the man and his surroundings, I am convinced that much injustice has been done and much undeserved obliquity had been cast upon him. He was not always wise or prudent, and his way of doing things was not always judicious. So, just goes to show that you can be as effective, brilliant, far-reaching, innovative a person as there is, but having a little bit of wisdom and prudence and trying to be as judicious as you can sometimes be just as important as having these innovative ideas. Now, what instructive example can we learn from Mr. John Brinton here? Well, he starts the war as a surgeon under Ulysses S. Grant's command in the Western Theater. He serves at the battles of Belmont, Forts Henry and Donelson, and the Battle of Shiloh. Brinton, though, is finally ordered to Washington on May 3rd, so not long after Hammond takes command as Surgeon General, just a week or two. And he finally leaves around May 23rd of 1862. And apparently it was a dream of his to go out east. He wrote that, "I have been dazzled by the idea of getting one of those recently created medical inspectorships and of leaving the Western armies. Had I only known it, I was best off where I was. The Western life, the Western men really suited me. I was among the men who were day by day making the nation's history and who were destined to become the heroes of the war." But Brinton doesn't know what will happen to him yet, so he heads west. He becomes the first curator of the Army Medical Museum, and it's his job to collect medical specimens, to oversee the growing collection of the Army Medical Museum, and to facilitate the writing and publishing of the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion, these incredible records that Jake was talking about earlier. And so he's going about his business. There's all kinds of incredible stories about John Brinton. Jake has written a really incredible blog post about his life and would make for, I think, a pretty fascinating mini-series in its own right. The places he goes, the things he sees, and all that in his capacity as the first curator of the Army Medical Museum. But this eventually does come to an end. It happens in the fall of 1864 on the eve of a presidential election, just a month or so beforehand. September 30th, he is in Winchester, Virginia, overseeing a series of hospitals, collecting specimens as part of the 1864 Valley Campaign. We touched on that a little bit when we did our virtual battlefield tour of Cedar Creek. Check that out if you haven't already on our Facebook page. But Brinton is there when he gets a summons to return to Washington. He said he wasn't he writes in his memoirs, which are a pretty great read, I would add. He says in his memoirs that he wasn't sure what the occasion was, but he felt that, quote, something was in the wind. And when he returns to Washington, he discovers, and again, this is about a month or so after Hammond has been officially relieved, that he is no longer the curator of the Army Medical Museum. Hammond and Brinton, of course, were fairly close, as Hammond is the one that appoints him to his position. Brinton doesn't totally understand why he was relieved of command. And as he writes it, the main silver lining for him was that he finally got to be done with writing the medical and surgical history, which is the least favorite part of his job as curator. He so enjoyed visiting the hospitals, caring for the soldiers, gathering the medical specimens. He enjoyed that aspect of the job, but not so much the actual writing. And initially he said, he wondered, like, what did I do? Like, was the writing that bad? They said, no, that wasn't the issue. And he tries to read the tea leaves a little bit and narrow things down as to exactly what it is. And he writes, in this atmosphere that he finds himself, and I think it's particularly appropriate, as this was on the eve of a presidential election in 1864, he wrote, "In Washington, in bureau life at that time, everyone had enemies. The outs wanted to become the ins, and everyone who was in, ipso facto, became a target for the malice of his enemies. I suppose in the very nature of things that kind of target practice was not only justifiable, but even praiseworthy, and by some considered patriotic." So this is the milieu that both Brinton and Hammond are inhabiting. And before he was relieved of command, or relieved of his curatorship at the Army Medical Museum, acting Surgeon General, no, it was just the time period after Hammond had been relieved in August, and when Brinton was relieved in September. So he gets called into Surgeon Barnes' office, and he's holding a letter that was written anonymously that said that Brinton, quote, was a friend of the overthrown William Hammond and a secret enemy of Dr. Barnes, and warned him against me, me being Brinton. Barnes, after telling Brinton that that's what the letter said, held it over a candle and burned it and said that we would speak no more of it. And he wasn't going to think anything of it, but as Brinton tells it, he noticed that Barnes always regarded him with an air of suspicion after that. So this kind of cloak and daggers world, burning of anonymous letters, implicating other people, saying certain people are friends of other people. This is the world that the world that all politicians during the Civil War in Washington are having to navigate. And that includes high-ranking medical officers like Hammond and Brinton. And to not be kind of judicious could set you up for failure. But in the case of Brinton, it ran even, he had even more stacked against him than that. Brinton bumps into an old colleague after he was officially relieved on October 3rd, and he says, what's the deal? Like, do you have any insight as to why I was relieved? And he says, "Doctor, what is General McClellan's middle name?" "George Brinton McClellan." That's all I can say. And George Brinton McClellan, of course, the Democratic candidate running against Abraham Lincoln in that 1864 election. George Brinton McClellan, his middle name, sharing, of course, with John Brinton. It turns out they were cousins, and that kind of familial connection and the close relationship with William Hammond was all it took for John Brinton to be relieved. So here's McClellan in his military attire, and Brinton had all that stacked up against him, and he writes that he wasn't sorry to leave Washington, quote, out of reach of the wire pulling and scheming and envy of that political place. So there you have it, the politics of Civil War medicine. A challenging and daring place to tread for not just politicians, but high-ranking medical officers.
Good stuff, John. Good stuff.
Yes. So, you know, Civil War medicine, it's about more than just care, you know, medical care on the battlefield, binding of physical wounds and things like that. There's a lot more to it than just that. And kind of like Jake was saying earlier, some of the other stuff doesn't get talked about as much because, of course, whoever's in charge of the medical departments plays a pretty significant role in exactly how some of that medical care gets taken out, what drugs are going to be administered to patients, mercury or not mercury, among many other things. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief look. Any questions or comments from the comments? Thank you all
Yes.
for bearing with us in the comments. It's been sort of a wild afternoon, I know.
Yeah. Thank you all for sticking with us through the barrage of spam, which we are trying and endeavoring to avoid in the future. So, a question from Barbara for you, John. She says, question about one of John's recent talks with pictures of remains, bones, and skulls. Were these men who never got buried and were just left on the field, or were they being dug up for reburial?
Great question, Barbara. And in case you missed that, that was a recent video I did. It's called Strange Tales of Civil War Medicine. And it was about the gross, ghoulish, and ghastly true stories from Civil War medicine. Check that video out. That was a fun one. So it was a little bit of both in answer to your question, Barbara. Some of them had been buried, some of the bodies had fallen on the field and had not yet been buried. The photographers were quick to the field to capture those haunting images. Others had been buried, but the graves were not deep, and so rains over the course of a year or two kind of washed some of the bodies up, and some of which were just never buried. They just never got to it at all, and the bodies just remained there over time. And finally, the remains were found and then photographed or buried much later. So it was a mixture of all of the above.
All right, and we had a question here from Craig, which has been answered in part in the comment section, but was asking about the medical benefits of mercury. That has been answered pretty well in the comments between, I think it was Matthew and Dr. Willen.
John Willen's always there to bail me out. Every time I forget something, without fail, John Willen's always there in the comments. So shout out to John Willen, member and friend of the museum. Appreciate you.
Yep. And just to add to that a little bit, medical thought in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, mercury had a place in the treatment of various ailments tied into this idea of medical thought, which is going away at the time of the Civil War, but what's known as heroic age of medicine, which mercury had a pretty prominent part both in treatment of various forms of stomach ailments as well as other diseases, including things like syphilis. You see that being treated. So they used it in a variety of fashions, none of which had any medical benefits, much more efficient as a poison than as a medicine, as a medication. I will say, I think from the kind of the last element here to touch on from the comments section, I really like the comment from Robert, kind of echoing some of the things that we have said in this presentation, John, saying all healthcare is political, still is, likely always will be. Jealousies, competitive grants, operating room time, a lot of these things play out in the civilian world today. They play out in the museum world as well. Politics are everywhere. And it is important for us, as we're looking backwards to talking about Civil War medical care, to understand that, those same kinds of issues that we deal with today were present for those who were practicing medicine during the Civil War era. So it's important to keep that in mind, that we have a lot more in common with the folks that were trying to save lives during the Civil War, the folks who were living through the Civil War era, than we may think living 155 years later.
Yeah, that's a great point. At the end of the day, we're all humans, and everyone gets jealous for rational and irrational reasons. And you know, the human element to all of this, studying the past, people experiencing real human emotion, you know, in real time. I think it's easy to get lost. You know, since we, you know, can't converse with these people and all that sort of thing. So that's a great point. I love that you brought that up.
Yeah. So I think John Willen does say that you do a great job, John.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that, John.
So
From
looks
one
like
John to another.
yep, looks like getting lots of thanks, and a good point to say thank you all out there for watching today with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for tuning in. As always, if you enjoyed this video, consider liking the video, sharing the video. It helps us out a great deal. If you're new here, we do a lot of these presentations. We do them on a regular basis, at least twice a week. And the best way to stay in touch with us is to like our Facebook page or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can keep up with the latest. If you missed the beginning of this, you'll be able to go back and watch the rest of this on our YouTube page, or YouTube channel or Facebook page. They'll appear there eventually. And to become a member, if you enjoy these videos, that's the best way to support us and help us to continue to bring programming like this to you. So I believe the next time we'll connect with you all will be this Friday. You'll be hosting this one, Jake, right?
Yeah, I'll be with blogger and historian John Banks. Has a great blog in which he's talked a lot about hospital facilities. We're going to be talking specifically about Antietam hospital stories on Friday. It should be a great time, and hope you all will tune in.
All right. So until then, this is John and Jake signing off.
Bye, everyone.